Hey guys, Craig here and welcome back to my YouTube channel. So in today's video we're going to talk about who wrote the mysterious and threatening Circleville letters. So grab yourself a drink and let's get into the video. So guys, this strange series of events took place in Circleville, Ohio in 1977. An Ohio school bus driver called Mary Gillespie started receiving anonymous and threatening letters that were postmarked from Columbia, Ohio. These letters expressed anger that she was having an affair with the local school's superintendent, Gordon Macy. The letters threatened her to come clean about the affair, otherwise bad things would start to happen. Although the letters began to come quite frequently, Mary decided to keep this from her family and from her husband, Ron Gillespie. She done this for several months until Ron received his own anonymous and threatening letter, warning him to inform the school board about his wife's affair. The Gillespies decided to share their letters with Ron's sister and brother-in-law, Karen and Paul Fresher. Since Mary thought she knew who the writer might be, she decided then to pen her own letter advising the person to stop. But then, bizarrely, on August 19th, while his wife was away on a trip out of town, Ron Gillespie received a phone call at home which made him so irate it compelled him to grab his gun and leave the house, telling his children that he knew who had wrote the letters and that he'd gone to confront them. He then drove away in his pickup truck, but sadly, later that evening, Ron was discovered dead inside his pickup truck, which had smashed into a tree. But even more bizarrely, Ron, who was not known to be a drinker, had a blood alcohol level of 0.16, but his kids were absolutely adamant that he hadn't been drinking when he left the house. Ron's gun had recently fired one single shot, but it's important to note that the bullet was never recovered. So despite the strange series of events behind Ron's death, Pickaway County Sheriff Dwight Radcliffe ultimately ruled Ron's death as an accident. But around this time, local residents of Circleville started receiving their own anonymous letters, which revealed Mary's alleged affair with Gordon Macy once again. And the letters would even go on to accuse Sheriff Radcliffe of orchestrating a cover-up. When Gordon Macy finally divorced his wife, coincidentally, Mary began a relationship with him, but she always maintains that the romance did not start until after Ron's death. But me personally, I'm not buying any of this. So Mary started receiving threatening letters again in 1983, and at around 3:30 p.m. on the 7th of February, Mary was driving her school bus route when she saw a threatening sign attached to a fence post which mentioned her daughter. So this prompted her to pull over and grab it. But when she did, she discovered that a piece of string had been used to tie the sign to a small cardboard box, which contained a loaded pistol. Since the trigger was also tied to the string, this seemed to be a booby trap intended to fire the gun at Mary when she ripped the sign down. But thankfully, the gun never went off. She then gave the booby trap over to the police, who discovered that someone had made a half-arsed attempt to rub the gun's serial number off. However, lab tests were able to make out the numbers and the gun was matched to Mary's former brother-in-law, Paul Fresher, who had recently divorced Ron's sister, Karen. So since Paul won custody of the kids and house, Karen Fresher was living in a trailer at Mary's property at this time. When questioned by Sheriff Radcliffe, Paul says that he kept his gun hidden in a garage, but since he never used it or checked on it, he didn't actually realise that it was missing. Sheriff Radcliffe also made Paul perform a handwriting test, in which he showed him the threatening letters Mary had received, and then proceeded to ask Paul to copy them as closely as possible. Sheriff Radcliffe thought that the handwriting was a close enough match and used the handwriting sample to charge Paul with attempted murder. So Paul was ultimately found guilty at trial and received a sentence of 7 to 25 years. However, there was compelling evidence to suggest that Paul was innocent. And I personally can't believe that a missing gun and a forced handwriting test was enough evidence to convict someone. Sheriff Radcliffe even told the police that Paul had confessed to writing around 40 or 50 threatening letters. But Paul absolutely denies this and says that if he had actually made such a confession, why didn't Sheriff Radcliffe record it? At this point, something just doesn't add up to me. Either Sheriff Radcliffe or Paul himself seem to be lying. It's also important to note, at this point, that Paul's fingerprints were not found on any of the letters, or the gun, or the booby trap. And a search of Paul's property failed to turn up any more evidence. And there was actually no ammunition or any materials that could have been used in the booby trap found at Paul's property. But Mary Gillespie also testified that shortly after their divorce, Paul's ex-wife Karen had confided in her that she believed that Paul might indeed be the author of the threatening letters. But Paul's response to this was, if my wife really believed this, why didn't she mention it in the divorce court? Yet again, Paul has a point, don't you think? Even though Paul was not working on the day that Mary found the booby trap, he did indeed have an alibi who placed him at home between 12:30 and 4:30 p.m. The prosecution responded with a surprise witness who testified that he saw the sign along Mary's Road between 11:30 and 12 p.m. that day. But he never notified the police, and there was no other witnesses that reported seeing that sign before Mary found it at 3:30. But surprisingly, years later, it was discovered that a key piece of evidence was withheld at the trial. 20 minutes before Mary discovered the booby trap, another school bus driver driving that route reported seeing a yellow El Camino parked at this exact spot, along with a sandy-haired man who did not match Paul's description. But mysteriously, the man did match the description of another man's car, that of Karen Fresher's new boyfriend. There was also a shoe print found at the scene of the crime, but you guessed it, it didn't belong to Paul. So after Paul was incarcerated in prison, a bunch more anonymous and threatening letters, signed by the Circleville writer, started to appear in the mailbox of people all over Ohio. Even though they were postmarked from Columbus, which was 90 miles away from where Paul was incarcerated, Sheriff Radcliffe became utterly convinced that Paul was somehow sending these letters from prison. So in response to this, Paul was placed in solitary confinement. He was denied all access to writing materials and was constantly monitored. But the letters just kept appearing. Even though the prison governor maintained that it was impossible for Paul to have sent these letters, he was denied parole in December 1990. Which is just absolutely shocking considering most of the evidence points away from Paul. A few days after Paul was denied parole, he was mailed an anonymous letter mocking him for this. Paul did not end up getting parole until the 20th of May 1994, And with the support of investigative journalists named Martin Yant, the Circleville Letters case featured on a TV programme called Unsolved Mysteries. But while the show was still a work in progress, the office received an anonymous postcard signed by the Circleville writer, which read, "Forget Circleville, Ohio. Do nothing to hurt Sheriff Radcliffe. And if UL sickles come to Ohio, you will pay." Paul Fresher attempted to clear his name and wrote several times to the FBI asking them to investigate Ron Gillespie's death. But nothing ever came of this, and he sadly passed away in 2012. Both Paul and Martin believed that his attempted murder conviction was a frame job, orchestrated by his vindictive ex-wife Karen in response to their divorce. Paul claims that Karen was the only person that knew that the gun was hidden in the garage. And after Paul went to prison, Karen conveniently regained custody of their kids and got the house. It's suspected that the original series of letters from 1977 were written by a man named David Longbury, a school bus driver who worked alongside Mary Gillespie. And he was angry after she rebuffed his romantic advances. But in 1999, Longbury was a wanted fugitive after raping an 11-year-old girl. He then would go on to commit suicide while on the run. It is possible that the Circleville Letters saga was two different stories which were linked together after Karen Fresher used the original series of letters as inspiration to conduct a plot to frame her ex-husband. So guys, that was the story of the Circleville Letters. Let me know in the comment section below who you think wrote the letters. I personally am not sure who wrote them, but one thing I do believe is that Paul was not the letter writer, and he was wrongly convicted. There is definitely something dodgy about Sheriff Radcliffe, I think. Is it possible that him and Karen could have been working together to frame Paul? I guess we'll never know. So if you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel, and I will see you all next time for another video. Bye!